Today we have an exciting rose ribbon embroidery tutorial for you in which I will be using vintage silk ribbons that I found in my stash to create these adorable miniature embroideries. If that's something you'd like to learn how to do, stay tuned. For today's project, you will need a piece of fabric that you want to work with. I'm choosing a Robert Kaufman Essex linen in this beautiful oatmeal texture. You'll want to make sure that it is relatively wrinkle-free or pressed, which is somewhat hard for linen, but just do your best. Some of that will stretch out when we put it on our hoop. You'll need a hoop that has a little bit of space around each edge of your piece of fabric. So that will depend on how many of these mini embroideries you would like to make and the size of fabric that you have to work with. This is a scrap that I had left over from another project, but I think it will make a beautiful background for these mini embroidery hoops. And I can get a few across the circle here, the larger circle, so I can do about, I'm hoping for maybe a half dozen at a time. You will need the mini embroidery hoops and all of their components. So it comes in a kit that looks like this with the tiny, tiny hoop. You can see it here is the outside, this bit. And then get the inside, which is this smaller piece. That is going to be where you lay your little embroidery over. And that is what we will use to measure the size of embroidery that we're going to make. Then you get a cap for the back once you have put a little fluff behind it and wrapped everything around. You put this over the back to close it off and seal it up, and I'll show you how we do that. It also comes with two microscopic little screws and the post that holds the top of the thing, the embroidery hoop together there when you're finished. So it will look like this when it's all done. And we are going to use a jump ring from jewelry to put around that little post hoop at the end, the hoop closure at the end, and that will allow us to hang it from a chain. So we'll get to that at the end. But you'll need these. I bought them on Amazon, and I will link them below. They came in a box pack here, and you got about 40 different ones, okay? So some of those. You'll also need a selection of embroidery floss and some scissors. You'll need needles and possibly pins. You may want to have some wax to draw your threads through to help bind them together, because embroidery floss, if you're not aware, is multiple strands of thread in one. And so if you have the wax, it will hold those little pieces together. You can see that there is more than one thread there. And the wax helps you to clump them together so that when you thread your needle, it goes a little bit easier if you struggle with that. You could also use a bar of soap. And I might be experimenting too with this old silk ribbon embroidery kit that I have. I have some leftover pieces of ribbon from a project that I did many, many years ago and never finished. So I may peel some of this or undo some of the rosettes that I have here and see if I can rework and do something to use up this gorgeous silk ribbon, because it seems like a shame for it to just be living in this box without a life. And since this is Valentine's Day, I think roses are a appropriate motif, and so I might reference this book as well while we work. I'm not sure what decade this is from. Let's see if I can find, 1997. So there you go, 1997. I've had this for quite a while. I even have the iron-on transfers that I never used, but that's cool. But I do believe it has layout ideas. I probably just traced it. I can see little dots. And it also has stitch designs. So maybe we'll just go ahead and follow around for this spider web rose and do the directions. So if you'd like to screenshot that for your own use, I would go ahead and do that. That is from Silk Ribbon Embroidery from this company that probably no longer exists. Oh, Hazelton, PA. All right, cool. Anyway, so we're going to work on that, and here we go. Let's get started. To get started, I am laying out my linen cut of fabric here and using my hoop to measure the size piece that I will need. I'm just going to cut off a piece that overhangs the edges of my hoop by about 1 inch to 2 inches. And this is how you would set up any embroidery hoop that you have. It doesn't matter what size. You want to make sure that you have 1 inch or 2 around the entire thing so that you can stretch your fabric over the canvas and it won't pull through. Next, I am using the little hoops that I have that are going to be my finished product, and I'm getting that little small hoop, the little small canvas piece out, and I am going to trace around it with a pencil and lay it out and leaving, again, about 1/4 inch spacing, or about 1/2 inch, because I want 1/4 inch on either side of this little circle so I can wrap it around. And then this is going to be the area that I'm going to stitch within to create my little miniature embroideries. So I got 7 on my piece of fabric, depending on the size hoop that you choose. You may be able to get more or less. I'm definitely batching this so that I can sell them for my Etsy shop, but you could make several for friends, to give away, or small teacher gifts. They'd be great for any of that kind of thing. Then you just lay the fabric over your hoop, slide the outer hoop on top, and then make it nice and tight. You should hear it like a drum. It will snap underneath of your fingers. Next, I'm using the spiderweb rose that is in that book design, and what you have to do here is find an embroidery floss that matches whatever ribbon you're going to use. So I have this very pale pink that I'm going to use up, and I need to cut and then divide up a length of embroidery floss, and this will act as the base of the web that we are going to weave our roses around. So you just use your fingers to pull your floss apart, and I have about 3 strands here. I'm drawing it over the wax to pull those strands together so that it's easier for me to thread on my needle. Like I mentioned earlier, you could use a block of soap if you don't have wax. I'm making a very simple knot at the bottom. And then I am going to come up through the back of my fabric and make 5 spoke wheels, or kind of like an asterisk with 5 points that we will use to weave our ribbon around. They all need to come out from the center, and I don't have to worry too much if they're really evenly spaced. That will help give it personality. And then when I'm done, I just go around to the back and I create a very simple knot by looping my fabric around itself a couple of times and pulling it down to the bottom base of all of those stitches to keep it nice and tidy back there. And I'm going to trim off those tails so I don't catch extra things in my embroidery while I work. And I'm going to simply go ahead and fill in the remaining little circles with additional spokes. And I'm kind of batching everything that I'm doing here so that I don't have to thread and rethread my needle a bunch of times, because that is the least fun part of embroidery, is threading everything up. So I'm making multiples of every single step, and then I'm moving on to the next step. Here I made the spokes of this one a little bit smaller, and I tried to off-center some of them as well, just so that I could create different little compositions. I didn't want everything to be exactly identical, so you can think about that if you're working with multiples, whether you want them to be exactly identical and you're going to try to make everything the same, or if you're going to make very slight variations of each one as you work. So changing the size and the placement of those wheel spokes will do that for you. Next, we are going to use our ribbon. to create the woven web. So I'm just creating a very basic knot here at the bottom of my ribbon. I had a really, really long piece and I didn't want to cut it into smaller bits, but I recommend going slightly smaller than this because it was annoying to pull such a long length of ribbon through. Then you're going to come up through the center of your spoke, and you can see here that it gave me a little bit of trouble and I was getting snagged on my embroidery floss. So what I ended up doing was coming up right next to the center, not directly in the center, so it didn't snag, and that worked really well, and you couldn't tell that it was ever so slightly off of the direct center. Then you're just going to go under and over your spokes and around and around. And again, here I would use a slightly smaller piece of ribbon so that you're not having to spend so much time pulling it through. But you want to leave yourself a generous length because these things do eat up the ribbon. It's going to use a lot of ribbon to go around and around. Again, this is a vintage silk ribbon that I've had in my stash probably for, we're getting close to 30 years here. So there's no problem in using it up. You could try with other ribbon. It might work really nice with a simple craft, like a thin craft ribbon, like a polyester kind of stuff you can get at Joann or whatever fabric craft stores are left. This is a really thin silk ribbon and it is gorgeous. But you could also try a bunch of ribbons and just see what happens. I've also done this with thin strips of leftover quilting cotton, although that, of course, there's a little bit more drag with the quilting cotton because the fabric is a little bit rougher than the silk and you will get some fraying, but that can add a really beautiful texture. So it might be worth exploring, especially since we generally have off-cut little strips of quilting fabric that need used up. So you could just play and experiment. So I'm just working my way around. You want to allow the ribbon the ability to twist and turn, not pulling it super, super tight because that's going to create that authentic petal look. Not all of the petals of these roses are going to be identical, and you want to have a little bit of that dimension in your work. So you're just going to go over and under and twist and pull until you have filled up your entire spokes of your wheel. It gets a little difficult to see at the end when you get close to the edge, but you want to make it nice and full. So go the whole way until you can barely tell. And then I was using my needle to sort of pull up at the very edge to find where I needed to go next. And I think that worked really well because in the end, you can't see any of my spokes of my little ribbon wheel. And it's just completely full of ribbon. And I also used my fingers, you can see, every once in a while to sort of fluff it out and make sure that the layers weren't completely covering one another, that they were laying next to and slightly on top of one another to give that really old vintage rose look, which I just absolutely love. To finish my rose, I just ended at my last spoke that I saw, and then I pulled my ribbon through to the back and just tied it off with a simple knot like I would any piece of thread that I was using to sew. And I just want to make sure that you get it really close to the base fabric so that you're not going to catch it and it's not going to be loose. But again, when we're finished with these in part 2, I'll show you how to mount them into little charms, and we will glue all of this stuff down as well. But if you wanted to use it in a different application, it's sort of important that you don't allow your thread to be wobbly back there so it can pull away. And then I'm just using my finger to sort of fluff it out a little bit. And there is our very first rose. I love the dimension that the ribbon weaving gives to the rose. It really stands up off of the linen. And this oatmeal color is just an absolute beautiful background. And then you can use your fingers to sort of fluff it out a little bit more until you're happy with how it looks. Again, here I am showing, I was started to come up to just the side of my spokes, and that worked a little bit better, but it is initially somewhat difficult to get your needle through. So just being mindful of that you're not snagging on anything, and then just back it out and try again if you have to, so that you're not pulling your other stitches out and through. And then we are just going to go under and over and under and over and around until we fill up our entire board with beautiful little roses. And each one will come out differently depending on the way that you created your spokes, how wide each spoke is, where it's centered, how the ribbon twists. There's lots of variable here, which I think creates the beauty of each piece. And if you were doing it as a larger composition, it would be gorgeous. Like when I was done, my daughter asked, "Are you cutting these apart, or are you going to fill it in with more?" And honestly, I had always just intended to use little hoops and make little hoop charms, but it would be really beautiful if you wanted to create like a whole composition, and you could still work in this same kind of grouping style and do like all of your pink roses and spread them out, and then go back and fill in with a different type of flower or a different type of rose even, to fill in your whole composition. And each little section would be similar but different, so it would be very interesting. Then when I got to some of the smaller roses, I wanted to fill in around them a little bit more. So I did French knots, which you simply make by holding the thread up from the back and swirling it around your needle, wrapping it around your needle a couple of times, and then taking your needle and those those twists of ribbon down back into the canvas right next to where you came up originally, and then gently pulling the ribbon down through. And you can see here that it twists itself into a little knot. And then these little knots look like sweet, adorable rosebuds. So for some of the roses that I made slightly smaller, then I chose to make a few little rosebuds, so it made like a rose spray around it. On this one, I did an original one. So you can see here, you come up from the back, you wrap the ribbon, in this case, or thread, around the needle a couple of times. You go down in right next to where you came up, and then you gently rock your needle back and forth while holding your thread off to the side, and then you're going to pull it down through, and that creates that sweet little knot. Sometimes you just have to like work your thread back and forth a little bit until it goes down in. And remember, the ribbon is a little bit thicker, so it might fuss with you a tiny bit, but you just have to work through it. And sometimes you have to pick it out and try again. And I think that's what happened here, is it got stuck on something. I had to take it out and try again, and that's okay. It's just ribbon, it's just thread. We can do stuff over. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time. In fact, it never has to be perfect. It's meant to be relaxing and enjoyable and an artistic practice. So once I completed all of the roses, then I wanted to add some foliage next to them, and I used some wider dark green ribbon that I had in that same packet stash. To make the leaves, you come up from the back with the ribbon, and then you lay it flat against your canvas, and you go back down through the ribbon to hold it in place. So you're going to go through approximately the center of the ribbon with your needle and draw it down through. and that will hold it in there, and you get a sweet little ribbon. It kind of tucks in and folds it into itself, which gives that really realistic looking leaf shape. And then I went around to each different little rose spray and added a couple of these different leaves. So I just worked either off of the side of one rose or here with the rose that had a couple of the little buds. I put some leaves around the bud areas. I just sort of filled in some of the negative space in my composition with different leaves, but you don't want to overdo it. There is something to be said about leaving negative space in your work as well, because it helps focus the eye on your feature element. If every area of the canvas is filled in with something, your eye doesn't know what to look at. So you want to be sure to leave some negative space. Then I found an embroidery floss that was just ever so slightly darker than the ribbon that I had. And I'm going to use this to add a little bit more foliage element. So a little bit different of a texture and a little bit darker and a little bit finer of a element to create a little bit more depth to the work. So here I'm drawing it over the wax to pull all of those threads together to make them easier to work with and thread onto my needle. And then I am using a fly stitch to create just more little leaf elements. Like I said, a different element of foliage. So you're going to come up from the back, then you go down across from it. So in this case, I'm on the right, left to right. Then you come up slightly down from those elements in the center, and you pull up and it creates a little V. And then you are going to create a little tail. So coming down, straight down, so that you get almost like a Y. It's going to create a little Y shape. And then if you want to make a chain of them, they will come up next to the Y, go over it to the other side, and then you'll come up at the base of that little Y. So you need your left and right to be slightly above your Y there so that you can catch it and create the Y shape with the little V. And then you're going to go down, and I just did a series of 3 here. Sometimes I did 2, sometimes I did 1. It just really depended on the look that I wanted and the space I was trying to fill. But I really love this. It adds a much finer detail to the foliage areas, and it allowed me again to fill in a little bit more of that negative space and create another layer of interest in my overall composition. For certain sections, I actually went around either side of my little buds to make it look like it was leaves on the outside of that bud, whatever that is. I'm sure there's a specific term like a bug cap or something, but that's what I wanted it to look like. So I went and I had the little bud positioned in between the center of the Y, or my little flies, there to make it look like it was attached to like a stem. And then other times I just went back and filled in with a little bit of that finer foliage. I think it kind of looks almost like an evergreen spray or just smaller parts of your rose bush. I love these. They look so much like little English roses captured on a little tiny canvas. I absolutely love how they all turned out. You can see the back here is just some little threads that we can then tuck behind in part 2 when we put them into the little mini hoops and make our charms. But I love the sweetness of this. I think it would be really fun to play with different kinds of ribbon and see how they turned out. I love the dimension. They're just absolutely charming in person. I hope that you found some inspiration today. Again, stay tuned for part 2 when we will put them together into their little hoops. And for more embroidery, quilting, and sewing inspiration, please like and subscribe.